Welcome back to All Rise. I'm researcher and content director Derek Caldwell with
speaker and author Abdu Murray. And
I believe that's pronounced Akbar Murray.
I told a story
I
recently.
think you may have.
I told a story recently where someone mistook my name for Akbar, and Nicole was standing next to that person. And if you know my wife at all, you know that she literally can't hide her emotions or her thoughts. She is the true Israelite in whom there is no guile. Mm-hmm. There's no way for her. She has zero poker face. She wears her heart on her sleeve. And so when this guy was introducing me to his mother at a store, she had one of those little topiaries, like a little tree you put on a desk. We have some stuff in the office kind of like that. And it was this little ball of a tree. So it's a little stalk and a ball of a tree. And when he called me Akbar, really loudly in this store, she said, Akbar, and she put the tree over her face and hid behind it as if this tiny tree that was smaller than her nose would somehow keep her expressions from being shown. But anyway, so you can don't call me Akbar.
It's becoming a theme that we're just going to discuss all the things you've been called throughout your life. But I did want to share, last time I mentioned, and we got Zach behind the camera, whose nickname is Z-Pack, of course.
So when you see Zach Falls On, make sure to call him Z-Pack.
Do not call me that.
Okay. But what I don't let him talk again.
Yeah.
What I wanted to share with people, though, was a way that you can troll, let's say, coworkers, your spouse, whatever. Because what I started doing, like I said, I'm not really someone who's ever had a ton of nicknames. Mm-hmm. But what I started doing, and when I actually started getting to know my wife, I would win. We worked at the same place, so I would bet her on things, and then when I would win, you don't bet for money, you bet to make people say certain things about you for the rest of the day.
Oh, yeah.
So for the rest of the day, whenever I asked her to, she had to refer to me as, when she's talking to me, as "O Supreme and Magnificent One." And so that was fun. But also, I said, and at least once you have to walk up to another coworker and say, "Hey, have you ever noticed that Mr. Caldwell has the swagger of a young Burt Reynolds?"
Burt Reynolds.
Yeah, young Burt Reynolds.
Yeah,
I mean, come on.
Plenty of swagger. Swagger all over the place.
So I just wanted to share that with our viewers as a way to get people to, if you're not that great of a person, this is a way you can get people to at least think you are.
If you're not that great of a person.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I got to say, knowing your wife, I can't imagine something more torturous than calling you that.
Yeah.
I can't imagine something.
Yeah.
Well, that's worse lost.
Yeah.
Bad.
Well, now you understand. That's the foundation of our relationship.
Yeah.
So
Good. Well, hey, I'm going to play host.
Yes.
I'm going to be the host for this one. I'm going to be interacting with you on some material here, but you've got an article you wrote for our website that all of you, by the way, really should read. It's in response to a question we got. Where we did some episodes on the virgin birth, and we did those for Christmas. And they're great episodes. You can go back and watch them, and in fact, you link them in the article you wrote. Yeah. But someone wrote in with a question in response to our stuff on the virgin birth. And the question was essentially, the Gospels seem to suggest that Jesus' family thought he was out of his mind. That when he was talking about himself as the Messiah and God incarnate and all these things, that he clearly was out of his mind. And you look at Mark chapter 3, verses 20 to 34, and it looks like they're saying his family members thought something was wrong with Jesus mentally. But the question came in, and it was this. It was a great question, by the way. Mm-hmm. How could they think that if, in fact, Jesus was virgin born? Wouldn't his family, his brothers and his mother and all these people know that he was born special in terms of being born miraculously? And so when he makes sort of outlandish claims about himself, why would they think he's crazy? But the gospel seem to suggest that. So you took it upon yourself to answer the question in a very thorough way, which is one of the charms about Derek's responses. Is every angle is covered. They're great answers, and we make fun of the fact that they're a little on the wordy side. They're not wordy. They're thorough. They're thorough. So
exactly as long as it needs to be.
Exactly as long as it needs to be. So when you go to our website, you go to there's a tab at the top that says read, and you'll get a bunch of articles. Most of the articles are written by you, but when you go to you go there and you'll look up, did Jesus' family think he was crazy? Look up that article. We're going to discuss it back and forth a little bit here on what you wrote and why you wrote it. But please do go read it. It's something well worth your time because it covers multiple angles, from translation issues to cultural context issues to the way we understand language and even narrative structures today. And it really does give a really great, a fully orbed view of a response to this question. But a big part of it is also an understanding of the way in which we come to think of human interaction is not so black and white. There's lots of shades of gray, and there's subtlety, and there's nuance in the way we react to things. Even when we think something might be holy or beautiful or true, we sometimes approach it from a very human perspective, and the Bible does that. So we're going to get into all that in this episode. So I'm going to do a little bit more of the question asking, and you a little more of the reacting, since you wrote it.
Yeah.
But I am going to chime in with my 2 cents here and there, as I am also wont to do. So anyway, let's get into it. Did Jesus' family think he was crazy? It's not a yes or no answer, but let's get into it. So the text is Mark chapter 3, verses 20 to 24. But there's also another text in John's gospel where there's an issue that isn't necessarily about him being crazy, but maybe James doesn't believe in Jesus. And so that's 2 different things. So let's go with the family think he's crazy thing, okay? So we'll talk about that first. And of course, like I said, the scripture passage that we're referencing is, and I'm going to read it out, not necessarily the whole thing, but it's important that we read the context of it. Now, I'm reading from the ESV, and there's different translations, of course, but it says, starting in verse 20, "Then he went home, and the crowd gathered again so that they could not even eat." That's how big the crowd was. "And when his family heard it," meaning Jesus' family, "they went out to seize him, for they were saying, 'He is out of his mind.'" Okay, that's the passage we're talking about. And there's a lot more context to the whole encounter here. But you approach this from different angles. One is translation, and one is context, and the other is more of a narrative structure. Like, how do we think of these things in a more of a narrative structure? So go with some of those areas there, like maybe the translation area first. That isn't the strongest part of the article, although it's an important part of the article. The part that I loved the most was the historical context and the narrative structure of the way people interact with material, even when they, sort of think something's true.
Yeah.
Anyway, so let's start with the sort of the translation issue and what is this all about?
Yeah, and I think one of the things that you're always trying to fight here is there's this almost, there's this idea of the paranoid style. There's this famous article, The Paranoid Style in American Politics and whatever. But there is this fear, I think, within Christians, and this almost anxiety even within non-Christians when they read a text too. And I've mentioned this before. You come to something that's difficult, and it's just this automatic, throw your hands up in the air. First sign of trouble, what do we do? Oh my gosh, it's all falling down around us. And I think this is the fun thing that I hope people will take away from this episode too, is you just jump into the text and you'll see there's really not anything to worry about. Because the very first thing that I noticed was there is an odd, it's not even a word, it's a phrase that is translated to the word family here. And so the phrase where in Mark 3, where it talks about that first mention of Jesus' family coming to seize him, for they thought he was out of his mind, that's this very general Greek phrase that has been interpreted a couple of different ways, translated a couple of different ways. So it either means something like those of his own, or it means something like those from his side.
Okay.
And more literally, it would be from his side, and people have taken that to mean, well, it probably means that's some sort of idiomatic phrase for meaning of his own. And they take that to refer to his family.
Okay.
And they relate that to, I think it's 12 verses later or something like that, where Jesus' family does show up standing outside of the house, his mother and brothers, and asking to see Jesus, but they can't get to him because of the crowd that's developed.
It's sort of like the same kind of context. There's a lot of people surrounding him, and they couldn't even eat, and now his family can't even get to him.
Yeah. So and the interesting thing was just, even before diving in, you notice some strange things. If you look at the context, again, you never get any indication anywhere else that Jesus's family thought he was actually nuts, right? That doesn't come up anywhere.
Other than this one spot.
Other than this one spot.
Yeah.
And what you see is that, okay, he's coming here. This is in the he's been going around. He's been doing miraculous healings, exorcisms. He's still in the region of Galilee where his family is. But he's even saying things like the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. That's in Mark 2:28. There are Jewish religious authorities who have already started to plot to kill him. And so you get to this point, and all of a sudden you see that allegedly his family thinks he's out of his mind, and they're going to seize him. Right after that, you hear in the immediate context, you don't have to go 12 or however many verses later, the immediate context, the very next verse, you see that the teachers of the law are coming down from Jerusalem, and they will accuse him of being essentially driving out demons by the power of Beelzebub. So essentially he's possessed by a demon.
Out of his mind.
Out of his mind. So the immediate context at least suggests that it seems like that's more like something that the scribes and teachers of the law would say, not his family, the out of his mind part. So then you get into it and you look into that word, and again, it's there are a lot of words used for family in the New Testament. Sometimes it's a word that's literally like of the same kind. It uses Greek words of like same, sin, and then kind. The same word that you would use for begotten. So there's that. Sometimes it's the word, most of the time it's the word for like the household of this, the household of that. The vast majority of the time that it's referring to Jesus's family, it is his mother and brothers. Because at this point, so we know Joseph didn't think he was out of his mind, because at this point Joseph is out of the picture, and the assumption and the tradition on that is that Joseph has died by this point in the narrative. So it's always that, and that's what they're called later when they show up in the narrative, Jesus' mother and brothers. So who could this be talking about? Well, if you think of it as of his own, and then the very next thing you see is that scribes and especially teachers of the law come down. Teachers of the law were typically Pharisees. It's almost synonymous. Jesus was a teacher of the law in a sense. That's one of the things that people marveled at, was that he talks about the law, but not like the teachers of the law, but actually with greater authority. Yeah. Because the way he was saying, but I tell you this, I tell you this.
Like Nicodemus is teacher of teachers, but Jesus is teacher of teachers.
Right, yeah. So again, there's all this stuff that at first led me to believe, I think they're talking about this other group that then, again, in the immediate context is saying essentially he's out of his mind. I don't remember where I was going with that.
So it was among his own and from his side.
Yeah. Okay. And so there's actually there's a manuscript tradition of this too. It was from manuscripts in I believe it was the Western text type. So it's from the Western Latin side of Christianity, from I think it is as early as the 5th century, and it's in more than one where they actually that phrase that was used for family, which by the way that phrase is never used for family anywhere else in the New Testament. It's the only place it's translated family. It's a very rare phrase, and you actually can't find it exactly like that in the rest of the New Testament, but you can find similar things. But this manuscript tradition, some scribes changed the words in there to say, instead of this of his own, they changed it and they put in the words scribes and teachers of the law, because they saw the same thing, that, and it could be that maybe there were these false views being spread, they thought, or that were maybe not true about Jesus' family, so they wanted to clarify. It doesn't mean they were trying to upend and change everything, but maybe they said, okay, this has led to some unclarity. We're going to take it upon ourselves to change it here, which was a very rare thing for people to do on purpose like that. And you can actually find some textual manuscripts from the ancient church where people will write in the margins, "Stop changing things in here, you idiot. Just leave it how it is." They knew what they were doing. Just leave it and we'll have to figure it out.
Which, by the way,
after
adds
that.
just an apologetic value too. The fact that they knew you were changing it means that they knew what the original was.
Right,
So
yeah.
it wasn't lost. This was clear. Everyone knew this was a clarification issue, not an
Yeah.
actual textual change. Or like, we don't know what the original actually said.
Right.
They know what the original
Right.
actually said. They were just saying, for clarification purposes,
Yeah.
we're saying this. And other people were saying, no, keep the original text as it is. We'll figure it out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And now, you'll notice when I was even trying to explain that, I started explaining one thing, I backed up and explained something else, then I came back to the point at the end.
Yeah.
So that's a Derrican sandwich. to
Which is
explain-
related to a Markin sandwich.
a Markin sandwich.
Okay.
And so one of the major reasons that scholars assume that this strange phrase is referring to family is because they're assuming that what Mark is doing here is a certain thing he does in his gospel, a certain way he writes, where he will start a story, interrupt it with a different story, and then get back to the main story. And so because there's this break in between, like who are these people? And then all of a sudden there's this other story that seems somewhat, it's like unrelated, doesn't tell you who the people are. And then it mentions his family. Well, that must be what the phrase is referring to, the family, because you've got
Yeah.
the two slices of bread and the meat in between.
Right.
And so if you take the meat out, then you have the one whole story there without the interruption.
Yeah.
So that's why they think that. But in my mind, you have to sort of assume, I think the Markin sandwich is something you have to have a pretty good reason for believing after the fact. You can't really assume it and then use that as your interpretive
You have to find reasons
Lens,
for
yeah.
the sandwich to be there,
right.
not just insert the possibility that the sandwich is there
Right.
to justify
to
your
clarify
interpretation.
this somewhat unclear
Yeah.
phrase.
You actually point out in the article that it's actually that is possibly, if not actually, circular reasoning.
Yeah.
Like the Markin sandwich exists because it has to mean family because it's a Markin sandwich. And why is it a Markin sandwich? Because it has to mean family.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's kind of and that's what I found. That it was just sort of it's just that because it is a difficult thing, and a lot of times you're also dealing with sort of the difficulty of Mark's grammar, which we talked about in the Anonymous Gospels episode. Is just it's a simpler grammar. He was writing in Koine Greek, which is its own form of Greek. It's sort of it's not quite Greek. It's like its own version of sort of Aramaic speaking people writing Greek.
Yeah. Well, it's like when my sister-in-law came over from Lebanon, where she learned French, Parisian French, and then she lives for a time in Ottawa, and right across the river is Hull, or Hull, kind of depends on how you pronounce it, depending on how good of a French accent you might have. And she realized she could barely understand what the French Canadians were saying. Because their French, while French was a different form of French than Parisian French that she grown up in. Now it's not really a dialect. Koine Greek's not really a dialect necessarily. It's got its own sort of, it's Greek.
Yeah.
But it's got its own origin and the way and its own rules, so to speak,
Yeah.
and its own word usages
Yeah.
as well. So it's a little bit more crude one might say
Right. Yeah.
than regular sort of classical
Yeah.
Greek.
Yeah, and most of the New Testament is that, with a few exceptions, like the Book of Hebrews. Most of it is sort of this lower form of like common Greek. So so in the article I go through that. I also go through words like even take charge and things like that are the vast majority of the time in the Gospel of Mark are referring to religious authorities seizing someone or trying to arrest someone. So again, it's not definitive, but it's sort of saying, this you could make a good case for this not referring to his family, but actually the easiest thing to believe is that it would be referring just on the basis of the English translation alone, actually, that the immediate context, if you knew that word family wasn't actually there, that it was this other strange phrase, that it probably would refer to teachers of the law. But there was an issue even with that. So I was going through and I thought, there's a good case to be made here. But the issue was the same issue that we have with translating it as family, is that phrase isn't used anywhere to talk about Pharisees or teachers of the law. Again, it's just this weird thing, which if something's used only once in the New Testament, it's hard to, and it's not that common outside of it, it's hard to figure out what it's actually doing. And that's kind of what's going on there. So it could be this first option, and I still think it could be that. And to me, it makes more sense than thinking it's his family.
Let me slow down. It could be family.
Yeah, it could be family.
It could be teachers of the law or religious authorities of some kind, of which Jesus, at least to the crowd's perspective, would be amongst their ranks.
Right.
And there's another option.
Yeah, and so the other option I thought was really interesting. So I mentioned that there were two ways of interpreting this phrase. One was of his own, and the other was sort of those from the side of him. And so there was a scholar named Dr. Drew Holland from the University of Tennessee Southern who published an article, which I'll link in the notes, that did a really great job of breaking down, again, some of the more, and I don't go into all the detail he does in the article. It can get a little complex, but he really dives into this in the same way and looks at another issue. He actually looks more at, he takes the phrase that has been translated family at face values, those from the side of him. And what we know is that who was with Jesus. So if you, very literally, those to the side of him are the disciples. So you take that, and then he focuses on the word, he is out of his mind.
Yeah, because that's the next
That's
question,
the big
right?
word.
Because
Yeah.
if the family wouldn't have done this to him, why would the disciples have seized this guy?
Right.
And why would they continue to follow him if they thought he was nuts?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so the interesting thing is that nowhere else in the New Testament is that word translated out of his mind or referring to someone as being crazy or something like that. And you can actually look at, there are parallel passages in the synoptics where, for people that, the synoptics have a lot in common, and they have a lot of parallel passages where you'll find the same basic story in certain parts word for word, and some parts with slight differences in wording, but you'll find it in Matthew, Mark, and Luke in very similar ways.
Yeah.
And you'll find the same, some stories repeated in John also. It's just not in the same, you can tell they're not quite getting it from the same source.
Yeah.
So you can compare this, because there are other times when Jesus, that in those Gospels where it talks about this story essentially, where there's a crowd, there's a house, and the crowd has a certain reaction to Jesus. And the crowd is always amazed at Jesus. And in one of the Gospels, it uses the exact same word, but in that case, it's translated as amazed. And in the other Gospel,
word is what? You said the exact same word.
Oh, the exact same word that's translated out of his mind is translated as amazed in parallel passages.
Got it.
That are a little bit more clear. And they're also not talking about his family until later. It's a little bit more explicit that his family isn't mentioned in that part. So what he noticed was that when you look at the parallel passages, you see a story that looks like other stories in the New Testament, where Jesus attracts a crowd, the crowd grows, the disciples try to protect him from that adoring crowd, that crowd that's sometimes maybe even whipped up into a frenzy because he's doing these miracles, he's exorcising demons, and they all have things they want to get healed, or family members they want to get in front of him for their healing. So he asked, well, does this word have to be translated as he's out of his mind? And essentially, it doesn't. And again, it's not translated that way in any other part of the New Testament. So he said the issue was, again, the assumption that it's referring to something the family is saying about Jesus forces the translation to say something like, why would they come to seize him? But if you try to relate it to the parallel passages, try to understand that it's doing the same thing, Don't assume that it means family. And then take into account the way Mark, his weird grammar, the way he sometimes structures sentences, where he will kind of do this. He calls it like a split thing, where Mark will sometimes split. And he has some examples of other places Mark does this. He says,
Drew Holland you're talking about.
Drew Holland, yeah. So Dr. Drew says
Not
that
the Drew you're thinking of.
I'm sure he's probably gotten that so many times.
Yeah.
I apologize, but what he ends up pointing out is that the he is out of his mind is not referring to the people to the side of him who try to take him. Those are he says it could be his family also, but it's probably his disciples. Although some of his disciples may have been his family, so it could have been either one, who are trying to protect him from the adoring crowd.
Yeah.
Because we just talked about the crowds, and so he actually gives a translation of it. It might be a little bit easier. So he says that if you take into account the split and what makes more sense based on even the parallels and trying to figure this out, that a better translation would be this. So, in having heard, the ones near him, his disciples or his family, went out to take hold of him, not in a violent way, but in a protective way. For they, the crowd, were saying he has amazed us. And that fits. It's an argument from the grammar. It's an argument from the Greek words themselves, and from the overall context of what we know from everywhere else in the Bible, which is that Jesus' family never thought he was crazy. We just don't have that recorded anywhere, unless you believe this is what Mark 3 is saying.
Right. So I'm going to summarize then, because there's on the translation issue, we're going to move away from the translation issue in a second here, but there's possibilities. One is that his family thought he was out of his mind.
Right.
That is definitely a possibility. And the reason why I want to say it's definitely a possibility is because when you look at the major translations into the English, from the English Standard Version to the NET, the New English Translation, to the NIV, they all have that way. All of them do. None of them say it could be elsewise. They're saying this is the way it is. The NET, by the way, I would recommend when you go to the NET Bible, the NET, which has got almost more footnotes than it has verses. Well, I think it does have more footnotes than verses. Great resource.
Yeah.
And they go in and they make the case why it's family and why it's out of his mind. So we want you to see both of those things, definitely. The second translation possibility is it's that the people who were saying is out of his mind were the teachers of the law. And there's a context issue with that as well. And the third possibility is not that everyone's saying he's out of his mind and no one's seizing him. It's that those who were close to him, family or otherwise, or disciples, were trying to protect him because the crowd was amazed. So those are the three.
Yeah.
Those are the three main possibilities, one of which is the one we typically see in the Bible as well. But
I do want to point out, too, a lot of those, even in the commentaries, there is confusion. They're falling back on the Mark and Sandwich. But also they haven't really interacted with Dr. Holland's work on it, which I hope gets a wider, if this...
How recent is this article?
I think it was, it's within the last 10 years at least.
Okay.
I'd have to, here, I can actually pull it up real quick. Yeah, it's from, barely, it's from 2017.
Okay.
So...
it's 8 years, it's a little bit less than 8 years old.
Yeah, and I looked him up. It doesn't look like a thing that he focuses a lot on. He hasn't written more about it that I can find other than this article. But it's one that I hope other scholars get a hold of it and wrestle with it and see, because I think again it makes a lot of sense, especially when you compare those parallels.
Yeah,
those parallels to me are I think it's Matthew's is very close to Mark's, very close. And I think that's the one where he's using the same word, and it's the narrative itself is very similar, but it's clear, because Matthew's being a little bit more clear in the language, there's no mention of family beforehand or thinking he's crazy or anything like that, that it's all about the crowds being amazed.
Yeah. So a couple of things is that one of the things you said earlier was this is the only place in the New Testament where we see this phrase being translated as he's out of his mind. Existe, I think, is the Greek word. But we have parallels when you look at the NIV. Has parallel passages in other places. One's in Acts, one's in Matthew, and other places as well. There's parallels to this story that don't translate it as he's out of his mind. So talk about some of those, just to make sure that we're not just saying stuff.
Right.
We want to make sure that when we say it, we're actually being accurate here.
Well, I'll go to the one that's the most direct parallel from Matthew 12. I did just want to say real quick, too, that Dr. Holland translates the word to being more about a positive, albeit disrupted, mental state. So it is talking about like a mental state changing, but it's a positive thing. It's typically not.
It's almost like euphoria.
Yeah. And so what you find then, so one of the parallels would be Matthew 12, verses 22 to 37, pretty much. But we see everything we need to within the very first part of Matthew. And it kind of clarifies. So this is the NIV version, and it says, Then they brought Jesus, a demon-possessed man who was blind and mute, and Jesus healed him, so that he could both talk and see. All the people were astonished and said, Could this be the son of David? But when the Pharisees heard this, they said, It is only by Beelzebul, the prince of demons, that this fellow drives out demons. So, what's going on there is you see it's talking about the same story. Most likely. It's the same part where the Pharisees or teachers of the law will say he's possessed by demons.
Yeah.
Something has happened, and there were people there, a crowd, who had a reaction to it. But the same word that is being translated in Mark as out of his mind is translated here properly as astonished. It's the exact same Greek word about the crowd being astonished in this parallel.
Okay.
And let me see if it's even. Okay, we might just leave it at that. Oh, sorry. I'm going to finish up there.
Yeah. And then go ahead. I would say because the word astonished here, by the way, as I'm looking it up, is to cause someone to be so astounded as to be practically overwhelmed.
Yes.
So there is this altered sort of mental state.
Yeah. Well, and they say right after, could this be the son of David? That's not just, hey, could this be David's kid? Is this the long-awaited Messiah come to rescue? So if they're being driven to asking that question based on something he did, I'd say they're pretty astonished by what they've just witnessed. Especially they would have known. A lot of times they knew. You see this with the Gerasene demoniac. They knew that person. They knew this wasn't. He didn't. Put in someone in the crowd who was going to go like a magician might. Or
he wasn't
a
plant.
No, he wasn't a plant at all. They knew the guy. They knew something was very wrong with him. Jesus did something to him, and then suddenly he can talk again. But just to finish that up too, a lot later in still the same chapter of Matthew. Obviously, these weren't original, but later on in the chapter, verse 46, now Jesus' mother and brothers show up while Jesus was still talking to the crowd. So again, it's paralleling Mark, but you're seeing what's actually going on, that the crowd is astonished at Jesus. And that's what it is. And there's no mention of his family thinking he was out of his mind.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And just so I think it's important is that when Matthew fleshes out more detail than Mark tends to, Mark tends to be more of a hurried style.
Right.
Mark tends to need to get to the frequent and immediately kind of thing, which smacks of Peter all over the place. That this is actually his eyewitness testimony, and he wants to get to the point.
And someone who maybe doesn't have that great of a grasp on the language, who, if you don't have a great grasp, you're not going to write a large, Matthew spends more time because Matthew's a little bit better with it. So I wonder if that's even part of it too. If I was writing something if I was trying to write something in Spanish, which was a language I took a long time ago, it'd take me a long time. The article I wrote for this would be a lot shorter if I had to write it in Spanish.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point. And anybody who has another language as a second language or a third language, and that would be generous in some instances, would say, if I wrote a letter I would be as brief as humanly possible so that I don't step all over myself
Right,
with this
right.
whole thing. So yeah, I get that.
So
Okay,
good-
so just
yeah.
to wrap up this part of it, because I think this is important, we want to have two parts to this episode. And the first one is the translation issue.
Right.
So we have different possibilities for the translation. We went through them. One is the traditional translation in English Bibles that his family tried to take a hold of him because they thought he was crazy is a possible translation. The second one is that it was the actual teachers of the law who called him out of his mind, not his family. The third one is that no one's calling him out of his mind, is that people are quite amazed at what he's doing. And so the word that's translated out of his mind is really that the crowd is so astonished by him
Right.
that they're sort of whipped up into this like almost euphoric, oh my goodness, the son of David is finally here kind of a thing. And the Jesus' family and or people who were close to him, like the disciples, want to protect him from the frenzy. But let's go now, because I think the second part of your article, which is very powerful, I think, is let's even assume that it could mean his family was like, what's going on with this guy? Even if it's that, the original question was, if the virgin birth was true, his family has no business being astonished with him.
Right.
Because he was already born astonishingly. And, well, I should say, his family has no business thinking he's crazy, given the crazy way he was actually born, and they all knew it.
Right.
So let's make the assumption that the traditional translation is actually the accurate translation. You have an argument in response to that as well, which I think is one of the more powerful parts of this article. So go ahead and unpack that for us.
Yeah. Which one of the there's
a lot
of
going
arguments
on
I'm
there.
making that,
Well, I guess the first thing is that let me back up this whole section then. Okay.
you want to do the John 7?
Yeah, I want to do the John
Okay,
7
okay.
thing. It's like, so let me, after I give that list of translations, the possibilities, I'm going to say this. This is the next thing. But we do have to deal with something, and you do deal with it in the article, is John chapter 7, verse 5, where James or the brothers of Jesus, or the relatives of Jesus, don't believe in him. They doubt. And like, so yeah, even if your other translation possibilities, other than they thought he was out of his mind, are possible, there still is the brothers and the family doubt him.
Right.
How could they doubt him if he was virgin born and they knew that?
Right.
So we have to deal with that still as well.
Yeah.
So even if the other translation in Mark doesn't have to be they thought it was out of his mind, we still have to deal with a very clear,
Yeah.
no one really disputes that these people who were close to him did not believe in him, or at least some of them didn't. So go ahead and respond on that one.
Yeah. So what I looked at there, there are a few arguments just to make right up front, I think. And first is that this is proof that the New Testament is a narrative about reality and not a myth.
Yeah.
Because the very first thing is to realize that, yeah, if this were a myth, if I were making up a story, the people closest to Jesus would be all on board. But in reality, we don't always act in accordance to what we know to be best, what we know to be true. Different things, fear can get in the way, anxiety, jealousy, especially among brothers. Different things can get in the way to skew your view of reality, make you act inconsistently with how you should act. The whole history of human beings is essentially acting inconsistently with what they know they should be doing.
Right.
And so that to me was just one of the first things, is that this actually shows that this is real people. And so like even in the case of, if we were to apply this to Mary specifically, who knew the virgin birth better than anyone.
Right.
When you love someone, even if you have a strong sense of who they are and their destiny, whatever she did think that meant, and we talked earlier, the virgin birth maybe didn't necessarily say, oh, this must be God.
Right.
There may have still been some wrestling with that idea.
Yeah.
But even a strong sense of destiny, when someone you love is putting themselves in dangerous situations, and what you thought their life was going to look like is not what it's turning out to be, where the people you thought he was going to, God's people were going to support him, are plotting to kill him, and he's putting himself in dangerous situations.
Yeah.
You might say some things. You might, out of fear, doubt some things, or at least want to protect him.
Yeah.
So that's one of the things right off the bat.
Yeah, and I just want to stop right there because this is such an important part here. When I was reading this article and thinking some of the things through, the first thing I thought of was this idea of cognitive dissonance, is that you have two things that you know to be true, or at least two things that you have assumed your whole life to be true, yet at this particular moment they're contradicting each other. So example would be, you know your son was born of a virgin, because you're that virgin.
Right.
Or if you're a family member, you've heard the stories. If you have heard the stories, by the way, we'll get to that in a second.
Yeah.
But you've heard the story about how your brother was, you weren't there obviously, so you don't know firsthand, but your brother was born of a virgin. You also have, as a good Jewish boy, as a good Jewish girl, a extremely influential group of teachers of the law who know it back and forth, up and down, left, right, and center, who are disagreeing with him and saying, you're saying blasphemous things.
Yeah.
Like, and now you have two things you're competing with. I know he's virgin born. I know what the angel told me. I wrote a song about it. Yet it doesn't necessarily mean that the things he's saying are true. He could be virgin born and be the Messiah, but do I fully, completely understand, as this village girl from Nazareth, fully understand that the Messiah is in fact the incarnate God? And he's saying this now. And I already had this view that God wouldn't have a body, and yet there he is. He's got a body that I gave birth to. So now you're in a state of cognitive dissonance.
Yeah.
And the Bible, what I love what you're saying here is, what the Bible is saying is, these are real people doing real things and saying and believing real things the way people today would do it. It's not realistic. It's real. And there's a difference. It's not realism for the sake of a narrative. It's recording it as it actually was. And Lewis points this out when he looks at the gospel narratives. Here's a guy who was a classics guy. He knew what the ancient fables, the ancient myths, and all these things were all about. And he saw a pattern of narrative that was so different in the Gospels from all the ancient myths from before. They were shallow. They were simplistic. The hero is always the hero, morally upright and morally perfect and never has mistakes. The villain is always the villain. He has nothing good in him and he's always a bad guy. It's only recently that we have sort of these nuanced views of things. We were talking about it yesterday in the office, about all these movies now where we hear from the villain's perspective. Because we see people are they're one-dimensional. The gospel does that.
Right.
In a way that's relatively unique, even given some of the crudity of its language.
Right.
It still affords people multidimensionality, and the fact that people could say, I don't know if I understand or believe what he's saying right now, despite the fact that there's all these other things that would give me reason to believe most of what he's saying, or a lot of what he's saying. I still have this dissonance because I grew up with this other thing.
Right.
And I'm coming to terms with this thing now. So the fact that they doubt doesn't mean that the virgin birth didn't happen.
Right.
It just means they are having a hard time reconciling the virgin birth with what they've been taught their whole life.
Right. And you could look into the history of Israel too. There were people who had these sort of, if not miraculous births, then at least these sort of, they were chosen for a specific thing, touched by God, Spirit-filled. You had Adam and Eve, fallen, David, not a perfect leader,
Right.
Saul before him, Solomon, and all the rest of the kings.
Samson, you name it.
Kings
Judges.
being anointed ones. Which is the word, what sort of in general what Messiah means. So it wouldn't even have been, there's still this wrestling of, I'm sure, even with that in mind, of like, just because he's virgin born doesn't mean necessarily he won't. We will know at the end of the story that he lived a perfect life. But when you're in the weeds of it, maybe you're concerned that, like I think you mentioned earlier, that he's believing in his own, he's sort of puffing himself up.
He drank his own Kool-Aid a little too much.
Kool-Aid. Yeah.
Well,
So
and by the way, something else just occurred to me literally just now. You see the story of King Saul. King Saul, who was little in his own eyes, gets anointed king of Israel. Doesn't even want to be king of Israel, but gets anointed king of Israel, and then he gets
so far so good.
And then he starts to get really puffed up.
Yeah.
And then the distressing spirit comes, and he is out of his mind in a sense.
Yeah.
Yet he is the Lord's anointed. So this is the context in which these first century
Yeah.
Jews already have precedent for the very first king of Israel who's anointed, who has this, and the Messiah, meaning the anointed one, although no one understood Saul to be the Messiah.
In that sense that developed, yeah.
It's not an alien idea.
Right.
It's not a completely crazy thing for them, haha, pun intended, for them to think that the anointed one might be a little off.
Right. Yeah.
But the important thing here, though, by the way, is in the John passage, it's not talking about them thinking he's out of his mind.
Right.
It's a different
Yeah.
thing.
Yeah, and so that was part of I said, is there any way I could figure out at least what is meant by believe in him?
Mm-hmm.
And so, I went looking, and there's a lot of, and this was almost not super helpful, but you looking at specifically John. I try to stick gospel by gospel to sort of not just jump around, but within John, what does he mean when he says believing in? Mm-hmm. And so there were a lot of things, and you think obviously we think, oh, they believed he was God. Well, that's one of them that John pulls out, but there's other things too. Did they the phrase "believing in Jesus" is referring to his power over eternity, his overall mission as the prophet / Messiah / Savior. Mm-hmm. But one of the ones, and it's it was believing in Jesus in regards to the timing of his mission, and John, that's a popular, and you can get I list all the verses in John. You can get it from the article. There's a lot because he talks a lot about the timing, the time of the hour. My hour has not yet come.
Right.
It's not yet my time. And so even within, and it's interesting because right after they say that, Jesus responds to his brothers and essentially responds to them by talking about the timing of his mission. And so why does he jump to the timing of his mission? So maybe what they didn't believe in had something to do with this timing issue. And there were some early church fathers who, responding to this, said that, well, the issue with the brothers was that they had, again, a certain idea of what Jesus' life would be like. Mm-hmm. Same issue that zealots had. They had a certain idea, and it would be quick. He would give the Pharisees their comeuppance right away. And so that they said what the brothers actually were trying to do, were trying to get Jesus to act more quickly, just essentially, it's very much the culture today on YouTube, to own this or to totally destroy.
Yeah.
They wanted them to totally destroy the Pharisees and to get the mission going. That's actually one of the, and I mentioned it's one of the theories for why Judas did what he did, and why he was remorseful after, is because he wasn't really saying, I think Jesus is a complete fraud and I'm just going to have him killed and get money. But he thought he could force Jesus' hand into acting against Rome and against the Jewish leaders.
If I put you in trouble, you're going to vanquish your enemies.
And then instead, Jesus just let himself die, and Judas realized what he had done and couldn't handle it. Yeah. He's almost the anti-Peter. The Peter also turned his back on Jesus, but Peter went to Jesus in repentance, and Judas let the shame overwhelm him.
Total aside, by the way, I get asked this question all the time, is like, if the gospel's all about second chances and Judas clearly is repentant, why is he still called the son of perdition, and the devil's in him and all this stuff? And I think you just explained it pretty well, is that being sorry about something and regretting your actions is not the same thing as repentance. And I don't think that necessarily he repented so much. He was like, oh my goodness, and what have I done? But it's not the same thing. Yeah. Anyway, that's another thing altogether.
Yeah.
So
and I'll just, on top of that, and then we can, I know we can wrap it up, because I know this has been probably a deep dive into
but I
the
want them to
text.
read the article too.
Yeah.
So we don't have to go to every detail of the article.
Not every detail,
But these are some good points here. So we're going to wrap it up.
Yeah. A couple other things were just, there's the theme encountered that, a prophet's without honor in his hometown.
Yeah.
So there's also that. There's also, and I mentioned a story of a church I worked at, where one of their homegrown kids eventually, he grew up. They knew him when he was a little kid. He graduates high school, goes to college. From college, goes to seminary, becomes ordained in that very same denomination of Lutheranism. And then all these older people in the parish, in the church, were like, there's no way. I hope he doesn't come here and I can't tell him my secrets. I can't
Confess to him.
confess to him. I can't respect him as my spiritual leader. I've seen him since he was this tall. And so there is this like disconnect that the familiarity will breed something, not always contempt, but it breeds like this like lessening of the person. So there is, again, it's a very human element, and it again speaks to the reality, I think, of the story. But the more intriguing one that you liked a lot was the idea that, because all of this was framed around how could they do that if they understood the virgin birth?
Yeah, so the question originally was, how could they think he was out of his mind or even doubt him
Yeah.
if they knew he was virgin born?
Right.
Right. And the answer might be,
what if they didn't know he was virgin born? The brothers.
yeah, Mary clearly did.
Mary clearly knew. I would assume Elizabeth. There were others who would have known.
Yeah. And Joseph is gone.
Joseph is gone.
So he knew, but he's gone at this point.
Now, and because we don't have clear evidence. Now, it is a lack of evidence, but we don't have any clear evidence that the knowledge of his virgin birth was widely known, and there may be a reason for that. That's because if you believe the gospel story, that there was this massacre of the innocents that took place. The Magi share what they know, share the prophecy with Herod. Herod goes in a rage, wants to kill this
Coming king.
This rival to the throne. So he goes out to an area to kill all the children 2 years and younger. And so it could be that in order to, again, protect the life of Jesus and protect the lives of those around him, that they just never told anyone that this was the one. Because you can't trust, would you trust little kids, teenagers, with keeping a secret of that magnitude? That, I could even see this in, if you're in a certain country where you can't be Christian, you might, you want to bring your children up in the faith, but do you bring them up in the faith? Or are you so afraid that they'll tell someone, not knowing how bad of a thing it would be for someone to find out they're Christian? Because kids don't have the discernment.
Right. Regardless if it's the right thing to do or not, it might be again, you have a semblance of precedent to this with the firstborn of Israel under Pharaoh, when he was about to murder all the firstborn of Israel, the firstborn males. And so they basically didn't talk about, what happens with all the firstborn males, where the Egyptian women are not like the Hebrew women and all this. And they tell these stories, not necessarily lies, but they're not necessarily the truth either, about what's going on with all the firstborn males. So they have precedent for this. They know that kings try to do this stuff to avoid a deliverer or whatever it might be. And so this is not unheard of.
Right.
However, I just want to make sure we understand. This is speculation.
It is a lot of speculation, but just trying to, again, but it's the kind of speculation you do when you again see that it's not a black and white narrative, that it's dealing with actual difficult situations, real people, conflicted people, scared people, and trying to make sense of why may it have been like that, and trying to put yourself in their shoes, and you can actually figure out at least possibilities. And kind of reason through that.
Well, this gets me back to the closing then I would like to make, is that first, read the article. Friends, as we sort of wrap this up and I give a bit of a closing argument, so to speak, read the article. Did Jesus' family think he was crazy? On our website, it's got a lot more of the detail that we've already talked about. We talked about quite a bit of it. But the fundamental thing I want to wrap up with here is this. That this is an excellent question. I love the question because it shows that the person who's thinking about it is thinking deeply and scripturally about the interaction between scripture and itself and even social context. A couple of things to remember. One is that there are several translational possibilities to did Jesus' family think he was out of his mind? Was it family? And were they thinking he was out of his mind? There are different possibilities there. Second is those who doubt. There might be reasons why they might doubt because we're dealing with real people. And the Bible has this incredibly real account of the way things actually happened, not this mythologicalized way of looking at things. But here's the bottom line to me. The bottom line is we don't have too few answers. The question, if it's asked from a genuine standpoint, is how could they think he was out of his mind or doubt him when they knew he was virgin born? That could be asked, I need an answer because I'm curious. Or it could be a gotcha. But the reality is, regardless of which tone you use, the problem is not that we don't have enough answers. The problem, if it's really a problem at all, is that we have a lot of possibilities. When you're talking to a jury, and ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I would say essentially that there's reasonable doubt about whether or not this narrative is contradictory because there's so many possibilities that it's not contradictory. And so if there's only one contradictory reading, but a number of possibles where they're not contradictory, you have every reason to believe that the scales have tipped in favor of non-contradictory or non-problematic, and you've given us numerous reasons why that's the case. So thanks for the article. I thought it was terrific. I loved it. I think you're going to love it a lot and really enjoy not only the depth and the analysis, but also the writing style. So thanks for that. Until next time, friends, read Derek's article. Did Jesus' family think he was crazy? Until then, friends, the defense rests.